Let me start slowly the meetup. We have some slide deck also to show to people, and from the news, as usual, the greatest news, the Sitecore Symposium, which had a great success, and Rodrigo will speak about that. And about Sitecore User Group Baltics, Irina is placing our channel, links to our channels, so LinkedIn, Facebook, Meetup, YouTube. Follow us, like us, and you will not miss any other next meetup we organize. Okay, this meetup will be recorded and as usual will be placed on the YouTube channel. The agenda for today is, first of all, of course, the Sitecore Symposium recap. After that, we'll have some Energizer session, fun quiz as usual, and then we'll have DevOps and governance in Sitecore containers topic.
Okay, so yeah, I would take my pleasure to introduce to Kelly Rusk. He is a big-time Sitecore expert I have known in my decade-long Sitecore experience. It was very so fun working with him, and he is now the Vice President of Technology at an Engagency, but previously where I was in touch with him, I would say he was one of the foundational pillar stones of a big company. And when I say you are hearing DevOps or anything related to infrastructure, you are hearing it from an expert, godly expert. I know. So yeah, yeah. Yeah. So Kelly, stage is yours. Please feel free to ask or what would you like? You would like questions in between or at the end? How would you like the presentation?
We're going to be covering a lot of meaty information. Anyone can jump in as we go because, while you had all that fun with the review, I'm going to bore you to death. So don't save questions to the end here. There's a lot of meatiness here.
Okay. So stage is yours. Yeah.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can everyone see it?
Yep.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, team. So today we're actually going to talk about DevOps and governance in Sitecore containers. So there's a few nuances here. We're using Sitecore containers as both an example of good governance in DevOps. We're going to talk about Sitecore containers not only from the aspect of an Azure Kubernetes cluster, but also getting into the aspects of maybe even using Docker for local development. And so, I know that Rodrigo, he covered a lot of awesome stuff and where Sitecore is heading. There's still some that are interested about containers, want to know more about containers. And so we're going to talk about those dynamics, and hopefully you'll walk away with some good information that can help you. A little bit about myself. I'm not as cool as Kranti said. I'm really old, so I've been in this game now for like 27 years. So each day I'm learning something new. I love to architect, implement, and support large-scale Sitecore implementations, both from an enterprise architect aspect and leading a team of developers. And I just love sharing with the community. So just happy to be here today and to talk with you. I blog a lot, I tweet a lot. So on Twitter, Kelly JJ Rusk, good way to get a hold of me. And then thebitsthatbite.com. If any of you need to sleep and are struggling with sleeping, I encourage you to read my blog. It'll put you right to sleep. So, I would encourage you to take a look at that. So today we're going to talk about, our key agenda is we're going to talk about some of the assumptions for the presentation, talking about what make containers special, governance considerations, DevOps considerations. Then we're going to walk into an example DevOps flow. So we're going to hit all these points. And remember, I want to keep in mind, irrespective of containers, I want you to think of this in the line of governance and DevOps, because even in a SaaS mindset, you're still going to have a lot of DevOps and governance come into play. Any questions before I jump in? All right, hearing none. A few assumptions for the scope of this presentation are as follows. We're going to assume that you're using Docker for your local development, which irrespective of using Azure Kubernetes or AKS for Dev, QA, UAT, and production environments, is still a great tool to use. We're going to leverage an Azure Container Registry for image storage and distribution. We're going to look at Sitecore CLI, or another tool for serialization. I really like the Sitecore CLI, so I lean towards that. And we're not replacing the AKS cluster. We're not doing any kind of terraforming or removing AKS as we build. We're assuming that we have a dedicated environment stood up, and we're going to deploy into them, and we're going to leverage Azure SQL for database storage. So these are some of the main aspects we have in place. We're also going to assume that AKS cluster has Zookeeper and Solar running as nodes. So all this is like a normal Sitecore environment, except it's containerized. And we're going to walk through what that looks like momentarily. For kind of a deep dive quickly about what's the big deal about containers. Why do we like them? The reality is that even in a SaaS mindset, the back end of SaaS is likely containerized. There's a logic to it. And I want to share this with you, not to say, hey, go jump on the AKS bandwagon, because Sitecore still supports containers to a degree. I want you to look at it holistically and understand what is this containers. Even if I'm not using AKS, what's the value proposition of this technology? So the big part about containers, especially when you think about Docker, is speed. It takes just a few seconds to load up without dependencies. Efficiency, because you less overhead is key consideration. You can also isolate. So when you have an image that's immutable, you have isolation of that. So you're not worried about different parts of operating system or differences across devices. I can literally get off an airplane with my image and load it into production if I wanted to. We'll talk about governance and why you shouldn't just load it into production in a minute. And the big part, portability. So any machine that can run the runtime environment can support the container. So it's all about encapsulation. And when you have encapsulation, you can reduce risk. And there's a lot of great aspects when you do so. So when you talk about scalability, these images, you can add additional layers to them without affecting the base container or other containers. So again, easier to keep a running in production environment and add more modularity to it. And from a developer standpoint, this is what I love, faster builds, modular, and better collaboration. Now, in our team at Engagency, a good number of our developers use Docker for the local Sitecore development and get the images from Sitecore, irrespective of whether our client's using containers or not for their destination hosting environment. So the main advantage is we have a quick speed, we can pass images back and forth and get into a good situation. So when we think about virtual machines versus containers, this is where you start getting the efficiency. Where is this actually coming from? So when you look in a traditional virtual machine mindset, you're going to have that hypervisor, the host operating system, your infrastructure. When you come over to a containerized situation, that's replaced. There's a container runtime. You don't have to worry about this guest operating system. And removing that guest OS is a huge, huge advantage. Because now you don't have to worry about weird dependencies, different versions, or am I Windows 2016 or 2019? That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you have a container runtime and you can execute on top of this. And if you are considering Docker for local development, you can run Docker on Windows. And there's a great little app, you can install and run it and switch to Windows, and it runs exceptionally well. So I want to pause for a moment and ask the hard question. Is anyone here using Docker for local development?
Yeah, we just migrated the project to a Docker together with upgrade to 10.2.
Great. And how was that experience? Was that a positive, a net gain, or challenges?
Depends on the team.
Yes.
Everything is difficult if you don't know.
Yes, and that's the main thing. That's the main takeaway you have, especially when you shift a technical dynamic, right?
Yeah, but my experience, I've been through local hosted virtual machines, Docker, and one thing I noticed the difference, a big difference in my opinion, is first there's some changes in the routine of development, how you build, but that's a small thing. Also, for projects that you are not touching for long months and months, let's say, and you go back, sometimes I notice it's harder to keep the state of the old as it was before, because you have to take backup of writings and they are spread in different folders. So that's restoring. It's not easy as a checkpoint in Hyper-V, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a good dynamic we're going to talk about.
Yeah, yes. I want to add like few words here. So I experienced in many projects that it's crucial when you go to containers to have a strong patching strategy, because this is what usually really every team is missing, because they say, okay, we will just copy one config file to our environments, which is not possible with containers at all. Because like every time you deploy, you actually recreate your code from scratch. So this is crucial part. And one which I really like is that when you have containers, it's like essential, I would say, and really simple to create a local dev environment. And then you just reuse it. It's like super simple to with containers, because it's all isolated and virtualized. It's super simple to create a dev environment. If you need 10 or 15, like it takes same time as one or two.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a great benefit. And you hit on one of the main points is you have to think in layers when it comes to containers. You're gonna have your base Sitecore images, maybe some modules and your custom code, and that patching methodology is just critical for success. Any other commentary before we proceed forward? And great call outs, team. Thank you for jumping in on that. All right, we're going to jump in and really talk about governance. So we talked about this is different, and that's the main thing we wanted to portray in this last slides, is this is really different. So it changes how we think about our governance. And if you don't have governance today, I encourage you, you need to get a governance plan with the governance committee and have a communication plan for good policies. Start with 10 policies and standards and ensure compliance for creating new policies. And I'm going to show you a sample policy in a second for stage gates. You want to meet regularly and expand and improve upon your policies and standards. So you want to aim kind of for a C+, don't go for perfect, right? And being able to clearly communicate these policies out and standards to your development teams, to your PMs, to your marketing is just critical, because they're all engaged in this, right? So if you don't have some rules of the road, you can end up in a situation where somebody might be new to the organization, they don't know what to do, or you might have an existing problem. If you don't have it documented or a run book, you can run into challenges, especially when you are dealing with a different kind of methodology. To that end, I have a whole blog post here, and I will send this slide deck over to Kranti after the presentation, but it links right to my post. I have a 40-page governance template that you can leverage for the dynamics of creating your own governance. And when we think about governance and policies, we're looking to address things such as, what's your branch and deployment strategy? Having this documented. What about image storage and security when it comes to containers? Stage gates and approvals. Because you have this immutable image now, you're going to use the same image across your environments, kind of a build once, deploy many. So in that dynamic, approvals are very critical to make sure that it's going through the proper stage gates to get to production. What are you doing for disaster recovery or monitoring and troubleshooting? Because this is, again, going to be different in containers for APM and kind of the platform, the cluster. How are you monitoring the cluster? And what kind of pod-specific environmental variables might you have? So when you think about Azure PaaS, for example, they have app settings. Well, in containers, you can have pod environmental variables. So if you have this image, that's going to be the same image that you've created, that has your Sitecore image as a base, your custom code and modules all in one final image. And you're putting that across environments. What about connection strings? What about differences, any kind of tuning that might be different? This is where those pod-specific environmental variables come in, and you should have a documented policy of how you create those environmental variables, where they live, and our process for changing or adding those. So this, again, documentation is here to save you. And additionally, you want to think about environmental security. Our images by nature are very secure. What are you doing about connections into your cluster? Accessing the Kubernetes cluster itself, private link and connections maybe to third-party integrations. These are things you have to consider and document down. So it seems kind of ironic. We're talking about very high tech. It should be hands-off. But if you don't have your process in place and your governance, it makes it much more difficult to manage a containerized environment, or really any environment for that matter. And additionally, you want to think about not only your substrate of Sitecore and AKS, but what about other Azure tooling? Are you using Key Vault to store secrets? Are you using DevOps to deploy Azure pipeline? What about Solar Redis and any external integrations? And what about how you're managing Azure SQL or SQL management? So you have to think holistically when you think about writing governance policies or governing containers. You want to think about what are these dynamics that I need to manage not only for the Sitecore bits and how I deploy, but how do I build, deploy, and manage my environment now? And if you put these things in place, you're going to save so much pain because you have clear policies, clear discussions and dialogues around this. And an example policy might be all releases must flow through the proper stage gates, meaning they have to go through dev, then to QA and UAT before prod. And you could write a policy that releases go to the dev environment first by tagging images. Those go into the Azure Container Registry. If devs approve and we say, hey, dev's great, let's get it over to QA, you tag that same images again for deployment to QA. If passes, it goes to UAT. And if staging passes, there's an approval workflow for production, maybe. And this might require sign off from the release team in order to be promoted to production. So what we've done here, both from a policy and a standard, is detailed what I want and how I achieve it for containers, particularly around stage gates and ensuring I have a good process for managing the different aspects of deployment in this case. So again, governance is critical because if you don't have it documented, you're likely going to have challenges and a lot of tacit knowledge, meaning that a few people might know in their heads how to run the containerized environment. But if you want true benefits and efficiencies and runbooks, centralize those and create a governance structure around your containerized environment. Any questions about governance before we talk about DevOps? Is anyone writing governance policies today?
Like part of it, I would say.
Okay. Partially is better than nothing, right? Is anyone excited about governance? I know I get too excited about governance, but do we see the value of governance as it relates to containers?
I see a value, but I'm not excited usually, and
Good.
especially in the process of writing them.
That's very normal. So governance is kind of a necessary evil. No one likes to write it. And I have several blog posts. I just blog post about a React method for writing governance policies and standards. So keep it simple, start basic, and you'll be surprised how easy it starts to get. So when you think about writing policies for containers, think about the things that are going to hurt you the most and you're most actively working on, and it's become very natural because you're going to be talking about those issues normally. So don't go do an edge case of something you don't touch normally. Think about, well, you know what? We don't really have a documented approach to our branching strategy. Well, if you document it, you're going to be in a better place. So it's kind of a necessary evil, right? And team, I'll take a small sip before we talk DevOps. And for full disclosure, I'm not as cool as Rodrigo. This is just ginger ale, so it's not any kind of fun pop.
It was just Heineken.
Yeah, it was just Heineken. Well, Heineken's very light. So let's talk a little bit about DevOps. So DevOps changes a bit when you get into containers, and it's more the technology that changes a bit. You have to change your processes a little bit too to make it work. So when you think about this, in the development experience, what you have on the right-hand side, you might be developing your code and leveraging GitHub, but you're going to leverage the Docker CLI and these aspects to create your images, and you're going to push these into the Azure Container Registry, and those will end up in the Kubernetes cluster. So you're literally creating, like, instead of little lines of code, images that have a holistic solution as part of them. So you're actually going to be creating, really using Docker with the Sitecore base image, and you get this from Sitecore, the base image for like Sitecore 10.2, layer on your custom code, and you have to do this at per Sitecore role. So you're not really grabbing like a CMS and creating a bunch of transforms to make your images. You'll have a CMS, a CD. If you love XP like Rodrigo and I do, and sometimes a love-hate relationship, but you've got all the Xconnect roles and things of that nature as well. We do see that more and more in organizations are going towards XM for their topology, and then using composable aspects to create their whole environment. But even in that dynamic, you're still going to have a CMS and a CD image separate of each other. So when you develop, you're going to be thinking about these images per Sitecore role and testing locally. And once your images are ready, you're going to push those from Docker to the Azure Container Registry, which is over here. So it's a bit of a different strategy. And we'll talk about how we manage that momentarily. So additionally is, how do you get the content over? You're going to look at content serialization to the Kubernetes cluster. So if you leverage an Azure SQL, you're still going to be hitting and leveraging the Sitecore CLI to execute. And you should be getting really intimate with that. And one of the biggest challenges you'll have is not so much creating the custom image, and it's not so much the CLI and the serialization. It's how do you merge multiple dev branches prior to creating the custom images? And who does that? So we'll find a lot of times teams will work together on their GitHub and put together all the solution, but who creates the image that actually gets pushed in the container registry? And there's a few models to address with that. So, from an Azure Container Registry standpoint, if you're considering deploying into a Kubernetes cluster as your platform, you definitely want to leverage Azure Container Registry. This is just a very powerful tool. Even if you're not using AKS, it's a great tool for your custom images that you might create, or even custom applications beyond Sitecore. It allows you to tag and store and organize your images in a centralized area, and you can leverage Azure DevOps to interoperate with these. So when you think about this as it relates to Azure DevOps, ACR is a must, the Azure Container Registry for AKS. And what you do is you'll have this image and you'll tag it, like maybe, hey, this is going to be my dev version, and it's going to go to the dev environment, and then I'm going to push this into the environment. So you have to tag it to identify it, then push it to say, I'm here. So that lets the Azure Container Registry know what the image is and where it belongs, because once that is in place, you can push this into your Kubernetes cluster. So if I develop a CD release for my content delivery, and I port this into the container registry and it's tagged, I can have Azure DevOps read those tags and push that into the pod for the CD server. So it's literally like a little one-to-one hop, and it's all about identification. Azure Container Registry has something very cool called tasks. So if you want to do image builds, you can actually, and this is where it gets fun, we talk about who's going to create the image. You can actually create image builds programmatically and put that in place with an ACR task. You can use webhooks to trigger events as well. So you might have an event that happens when an image is in place. Maybe that would trigger a workflow for approval. Maybe it will trigger your CLI. And you might want to look at a holistic Azure DevOps pipeline to deploy to AKS based on image tags. So again, if I tag an image and have it built and put in place, Azure DevOps can listen, look for that tag and say, oh, you tagged me as production. You are now ready to go to the production content delivery node and replace the image that was already there. And what's fun is you'll see the image history. So if you want to restore an image, you could go into your ACR and look and say, oh, yeah, you know what? I need to roll back. So creating a disaster recovery plan, you want to look at how can I leverage Azure Container Registry images and maybe roll back to a previous release. And, leveraging Azure DevOps alongside a Sitecore serialization, you can have a win-win where you can automate all these aspects. So your image would go up, you would serialize everything and port it to the proper destination. Now, I just covered a lot in a few slides, and we have a few more about DevOps here. I want to get through those. I want to open for a few questions because there are some other critical aspects you have to decide on, and it particularly relates to, understanding AKS clusters, nodes, pods, and more. So Azure Kubernetes Service is exactly that. It's a service that runs around your cluster. And a Kubernetes cluster literally has different nodes that run the application workloads. and they're backed up by virtual machines. So your whole Azure Kubernetes cluster is literally these nodes that are in there. You might have a set of nodes just for your content delivery, and those are powered by virtual machines. So you can increase the power behind the nodes, and you'll port into the node your image. So when you think about these layers of abstraction, the service is there for communication, right? The cluster is there to hold these different nodes and power where the images are going to go. And the control plane is literally the orchestration of how all this works. And the nodes are literally like, remember the little example we showed in Docker of no OS and the container runtime? Think about nodes in that dynamic. That's kind of where the power is and where you're going to see some interesting settings as it pertains to being able to execute. Now, a cluster can have multiple node pools. So an example I just gave you might have a node pool for your content delivery, a node pool for CMS, and a node pool for all of XConnect, as an example. And you could have different power profiles based on the virtual machines for each of the node pools that you have. Your application actually runs inside of a pod. So inside of a node, there's a pod, and that's actually what's running your image. And that could have environmental variables such as your custom connection strings or connections to Redis, whatever that is. So in this dynamic, we're literally talking about here's a service. Inside the service is your cluster. The cluster has nodes. Those nodes may belong to one or multiple node pools. Inside of a node, you have your pod. And your pod in an Azure Kubernetes cluster is where your image actually runs. You can assign environmental variables. And normally you have a one-to-one between a container to a pod type aspect. And to interoperate with this, because images are immutable, you can't change them, you want to get really familiar with the kube control commands. This allows you to execute several aspects. So when you think about this dynamic, a few key takeaways you want to really consider about DevOps is you're shifting on images. You're really moving to images, so it causes you kind of slow down to go faster. You're not allowing any individual, there's no way to change code in prod. So there's no development in production, right? You shouldn't be deving in prod anyway. But this allows you to encapsulate and have very tight controls on your images and to put them into a very scalable environment. When you think about Azure Kubernetes Service or AKS, there's distinct images, distinct layers here beyond the images, where your content in Azure SQL, external integrations have to be taken into account. It's not just these Sitecore images that matter. So you can't, and I already said it, but images are immutable. No last second changes can be made. And environmental variables are going to play a huge role in this. So if you have one image that's going to go across all your environments, what do? You have to have environmental variables to put that in place. And when we think about the flow of the DevOps here, if you deploy something to dev, and it's that image, and then it goes to QA, and everything's good, you put it to UAT, and UAT says, hold on, this is not past UAT. You go all the way back into development, fix it, and it goes back through the stage gates. And that's critical that you have those checks. Because while you could deploy an image straight to production, you don't want to skip that, both from regression testing, a smoke testing, or other aspects. It's going to really ensure that your stage gates and images are really complete and that everything's very smooth line. And it takes a little bit to get used to this dynamic, to change and say, okay, I now have something immutable, but before it's immutable, I can collaborate together. How do I port this in? And how do I make sure that I'm able to evaluate it to make sure that my images are running the way they should? So there's a lot to take into account from a DevOps perspective, right? You're going to see more ops because of AKS. Where in the past, DevOps has been more dev and less ops. Now we're seeing a combination, a pretty fair balance between the both, where your branching and deployment strategy is critically important before you create that image. And then your operational aspect is critically important for managing the images in that holistic environment. So I'm sure there's some question around DevOps as it relates to containers. So, fire away. I'm ready to answer. And then we'll jump into a sample workflow, sample deployment.
I don't know, maybe you will cover this in your next example.
Sure.
What about like zero downtime strategy? Like
Yes.
as an example, app services as a PaaS from Azure come from the staging slots, which is like by default zero downtime approach, and Kubernetes doesn't have it like built in, easy to use, I would say.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And that's why I see a lot of organizations do a blue-green environment for their production. And the other advantage is allows them to smoke test. So even if I didn't have containers, I like true blue-green environments, especially with serialization and images, because I'm able to smoke test and make sure everything is good before I repoint using Traffic Manager. So I agree. You know, it's one of the limitations. The other aspect is timing and off hours. So you might not have zero downtime, but you could have off hours with Azure DevOps. My preference is more blue-green because I can port to production while the developers are still working. And I say production, it's maybe green is not live. I can port to green, and we can relax and really vet everything and make a smoother switch over.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
That's a very good question.
Like I have a continuation of this one. Are you using two different clusters, or you are deploying in a single cluster with like a blue and green tags and using some kind of ingress configuration before that's deploying?
Sure. Great question. I would actually prefer to use a true separation of two different clusters. And the reason is because I'm serving traffic. And if my smoke test goes wrong, I can now take down production. So I like to really isolate the workloads as far as possible. But there's a cost with that, right? And that's where what I like to do is I can scale down the virtual machine, maybe the node pools, so I'm not paying as much money, and maybe spin up the cluster when I'm ready. So you know that's the cost challenges, right? Because you could have different nodes and just do some ingressing and some clever networking to get around that. Because again, it doesn't have the deployment slots per se. Any other questions as it relates to images and image creation? Because I know it's a very hot topic.
I have some down-to-earth question with a pain point. So as right now in Windows 11 mostly used, at least on my PCs, and the Docker-based images, Sitecore-based images, still based on Server 2019, I cannot run them in process isolation. Is there any workaround to like fasten them up and reduce memory usage?
Well, are you leveraging? Are you using Docker Desktop, or were you leveraging?
Yeah, Docker Desktop.
And you're running those in Windows mode, right?
Yeah, in Windows mode, but still I'm required to run them in like Hyper-V mode instead of process isolation.
Unfortunately, that still remains an issue. It's not a Sitecore issue. It's more of a Windows and Docker issue. There's not a resolution yet, unfortunately. I wish there was a clever workaround, but not one that's been stable yet. So that is a challenge, unfortunately. But I know the Docker community is well aware of it and they're working towards it.
But maybe Sitecore will provide an updated image for 2022 at some point of time.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, and I would expect so. Some of these challenges go away, especially as the reality is there's only a few enterprises that are leveraging Kubernetes for their Sitecore environment, and a lot that are using Docker. So there is a push there, and I would suspect that it would get to that point quickly. At least I hope so. Great questions so far. I really appreciate the collaboration, team. Any other questions on kind of base DevOps before we talk about kind of a walkthrough? All right. Hearing none, let's jump through an example DevOps flow. So in this dynamic, step one is local dev setup and development. And I really want to focus on this image on the right, because this really shows you, here's a Sitecore container registry that has the base Sitecore. You're going to create Docker files that have the base runtime with your modules and tools and your solution. And maybe even for Solar, you'd have that. You're going to build that, and then you're going to push it as custom images. You can see you start with Sitecore images, you add in your own layers via the Docker file, and you create your Sitecore images. So, you know, the steps are literally set up Docker per developer, acknowledging the issues you just raised about the Windows version. Get the base Sitecore images and create custom images. And those custom images, again, are going to be your code and your compilation. And when you have those images ready, you're going to use Docker Compose to build those images, and you can push them into your registry of choice. Or if you're just using Docker for local development, you don't need to go to a registry. You just have your base images, and you can view those. And when you're ready to deploy to paths or virtual machines, you just deploy out your custom code files into the other environment. So step one is definitely you want to get that local development set up. I have links. These are all linked in here. So you'll be able to go right to the aspects. And again, I will email this right after this call so everyone can have it. So when you have your local dev set up and developed, you're going to test locally, running your Sitecore instance locally within Docker because you have a full environment. Remember, each image is a distinct role. So you can test with architectural integrity, which means that if my production is XP with CM, CD, identity server, all those separate images on your local environment, instead of running like an XP0, you actually have all those images. So you can actually test as if it were a very underpowered production environment. So as part of that, once you're done testing locally, prepare to push to the Azure Container Registry, and you can and should automate this entire flow on the pushing, including serialization. Step two, we want to build these images and push to the Azure Container Registry. So once you've done your local testing and you're prepared to go, we want to build the images. And there's a few options here. You can have an individual responsible for approving pull requests actually create the images, kind of a centralized governance model where they're going to tag and push. Or you can use like Azure DevOps and do an ACR task to automatically build your images from GitHub. And I put a tutorial right here where you can do that. So if somebody's on vacation, you know, Kranti's out, what are we going to do? Who's going to build the image for us, right? Well, you can actually use an ACR task as part of your pipeline to build the image on code commit. So you have a very powerful way to create your custom image as a team. And, you know, while it's more common right now to locally then tag and push to the ACR, sometimes they want that kind of pull request and review before the image is created centrally. It's well worth testing a pipeline within Azure DevOps. So at this point, you've set up your local environment. You've done a custom Sitecore image that has your own code and solution in it. Yeah, that's a custom image now. And you've built your image and you've pushed it to the Azure Container Registry. Once it's in the registry, we need to be able to deploy that to the AKS cluster from the Azure Container Registry with stage gates. So a few ways you can do this. You want to use that kube control that I mentioned. So you could integrate and literally have it work with the Azure Kubernetes service. Kube control is awesome. As you have a Sitecore role per image, it makes it a lot easier to push this over. So when we think about deploying in, now it's in the container registry, using this command, you can say, okay, if it's tagged as dev and CD, send it to the dev CD pod. If it's now approved to go to QA, retag that image and say you're now the QA CD pod destination. And so now we're deploying into the cluster. And so what you had locally, again, with that nice integrity, that immutability of that image, is now ported over. And with that ported over, it gets a lot of fun because if it passes, you can just keep retagging. And I really, really recommend before you go into production, create an approval step. So Azure DevOps is great for pipelining. So you can do an approval step. So now we've taken our image, locally created it, we've pushed it into the container registry, and we've done some automation and bring it from the container registry to the desired environment with stage gates. We're going to go all the way to production. Now, when you do this, you have to make sure you serialize your content. So when I push to dev, I want to serialize the content as well. That's why I highly recommend doing one pipeline to organize this. because you could create that pipeline to both build your image and serialize the content at once. And building would be an ACR task called from the Azure DevOps pipeline, because we can do the ACR task to build your image for you from your GitHub. And you can tag and push those images across those dynamics and have that pipeline include your serialization. So it's critical you get your serialization right, what modules you're going to leverage for serialization, and that allows you to bring stuff forward all the way through the stage gates. And as we think about that, serialization is generally a step after the image build, tagging, and push. So I want that image there maybe before I serialize. And this is why I'm such a big proponent of blue-green in production. Because if I push an image, I don't have my serialization in place yet, or serialization is going to take 10 minutes or something, you could potentially have a little downtime or a bad experience for your users. So if you're not going to do blue-green, consider a strong deployment window. No different than you have today, unless you are fortunate enough to use paths with deployment slots. And, serializing and using Azure DevOps, the benefit here is that you can centralize your building, tagging, pushing, and serialization without needing a super developer to create the images and do the serialization for you. So I would never venture into this world without leveraging Azure DevOps. And so for the first 4 steps, we've done. We've created a custom image. We pushed the ACR. We've got from ACR to the cluster, and we've serialized, and hopefully we're using Azure DevOps to automate this with a very smooth pipeline. Because once we have that, we got some post-deployment steps. We want to make sure that each environment has gone through the proper testing. Especially for production, you want to smoke test that to make sure we're ready to go. So if you don't have blue-green, make sure you have a good maintenance window. You might want to publish and rebuild indexes as appropriate. Remember, Solar is a different mechanism. You're still connected, and beyond your serialization, there's some important dynamics to make sure those indexes are up to place, especially as you have new data templates or other things of that nature. And if you're leveraging Commerce, you must bootstrap, may need to clear your Commerce Redis caches, and warm up Sitecore Commerce caches. And for those that know me, I'm not a huge fan of Sitecore Commerce. I do love Order Cloud and some of the offerings there. But if you are using Commerce, you need to keep these things into consideration. And as part of your post-deploy steps, you have to be able to activate your disaster recovery plan. And a great way to do this is has a separate Azure DevOps pipeline that can restore the previous image and maybe restore from backup your Azure SQL databases, or deserialize or reserialize the appropriate aspects. So as we go through this flow, what I've done is I've allowed our developers to work together in an environment that's very similar. So I'm not getting weirdness that says, oh, it worked on my computer, why is it not working on yours? I'm able to build that image, either having somebody who does the pull request or automating. I'm able to put that in a container registry and keep a housing of all my images so I can restore from them, and I can tag them for different environments. I'm able to push these into the cluster, and after I do that, ensure I have serialization in place. And I'm able to do a lot of post-deployment steps to make sure that indexes and things of that nature are taken into account. So this step of workflow, it mirrors a lot what you're doing today, likely, but it really forces the issues of governance and strong DevOps with these stage gates, because the images are immutable, to be successful. And following this methodology, you are reducing risk. You're giving up some flexibility, but the end state will likely be a more governed and more manageable environment. So I'd like to stop there and just say a big thank you for hearing me drone on about governance and DevOps and showing an example of a containerized environment leveraging this. I'd love to open up for any other kind of questions or commentary that you may have.
Yeah, meanwhile, there were some interesting chats happening as well.
Sure. Yeah,
maybe Linda, do you want to speak? Basically, you have a good topic. Do you want to speak about it?
Sure. I'm not really in Sitecore. I am in clusters in AKS. So we have AKS platform. So with other things, and we tried Sitecore, but Sitecore needed Windows nodes, and we were like, nope, not gonna do that because our tooling is not supporting Windows and etc. But yeah, but we have this layer of governance with cluster policies. We use Kyverno a lot, so not allowing registries. If this is not our registry, you will not come up, you will be blocked. And so we have these kind of governance, not in DevOps side, because we don't control that from other teams, but we can control what is allowed to run in our platform. So yeah, that was my comment. Thank you.
That's a great comment. And I see a lot of great comments. I want to address some of those that I see in the chat here. Rodrigo, you asked a great question about pods, really CI/CD pipelines and how to reduce this. What can be done to improve the long deployment times? A lot of the long deployment times really tie into not deploying often enough. Because if you deploy often enough, your changes are not going to be as large. Now, with the images and image tagging, they do move pretty quickly. So I would say that there is a challenge in that you are moving a whole image here. But if you're deploying more often, you're going to have less serialization, and your image is going to port quite quickly. We're talking a matter of not very long, maybe a minute or so to have an image ported over to a pod versus traditional writing to an app service, maybe w.root. So what I've seen is that there is some time reduction with more consistent deployments, and images help you get into more consistent deployment methodologies. You're not fixing some DevOps issues. But that's definitely one consideration. We're not just simply dropping files into the environment, so it's very small. You're always going to have a restart, right? The nice part is that with this environment, while you still have a warm-up consideration when the images are ported over, I found that the restart time is a lot faster, and generally that's my longest time for deployment, as well as waiting for Sitecore to warm up, so to speak. Does that help address some of your commentary there?
Yes, buddy. Yeah, thank you. Amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely good stuff. And Artem, that's a very good point. You can always create pods from scratch, right? And this is what he's talked about as well. You can deploy in parallel and only deploy the roles that have changed. So again, we're not releasing the whole stack, and that's the value of having per role images, because you're not going to deploy everything. Maybe you just have a CMS change. You might have a CD change. Maybe you're getting adventurous and want to change the search collection service, right? So there's different aspects here when you go to that very modular framework with images. You also have less transforms. So when you talk about CI/CD pipelining, environmental variables now in containers, you have less of these aspects in place. And please continue firing away. Are there additional questions I can help address? Am I missing any of the other core comments here? Let me check the commentary. Yep. Good commentary about the costing, the amount of nodes in the cluster, correct? Yep, you can do a single node, absolutely. So yeah, a good note about cluster configuration. So it is, when you think about this aspect, your costing and your architectural integrity is really about the cluster. So, where am I going to have my node pools? Where am I going to have my nodes that have the pods? The pods house the images. So don't focus on the end state per se of is the image that's causing the cost. It's more your nodes and the node pools when you think about how much is it going to cost me to run a containerized environment. So, those are the aspects that come into play. Question about possible to combine Sitecore roles into single images to save resource costs. No, that would be disruptive to the pipelines because again, we're very much a single image dynamic per role in this environment. Any other questions or things I can help address here? And great commentary during the discussion so far, team. Thank you for putting up with me and my love of governance and DevOps and all things that fit together.
Thank you very much. It was. It seems like a really hot topic, and I see the discussions going behind that touches our audience. So really, thank you very much. Big applause.
Yeah, and I would say that, there's one thing to take away is that my sense is that we're not going to end up with a lot of individuals using AKS for their destination, but a lot of developers using Docker. And so I'm hoping that this helps you understand the dynamics of understanding that there are layers now. So think about images, you have to change your methodology and your governance a bit. Like I said, for what we do today, we build in Docker, and then we deploy from our GitHub after we validate things in Docker locally with pull requests. So you can have the best of both worlds. But I hope that's enlightened you. And I just want to thank you for allowing me to share today. And if you need anything, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. My blog is right there if you need to sleep and read boring topics. Like Rodrigo, we're a community, and I don't have all the answers, but I will always make time.
Unfortunately, he missed out this beauty of his session in Symposium due to some circumstances, but we are the first ones to host him. Proud, and we'll be uploading it on YouTube as well, Kelly. So, to share this knowledge. Yeah. And we'll inform you. Yeah.
No,
thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Really good overview of the Docker and isolation benefits. Thank you.
Happy to help. Thank you for coming today.
Okay, we thank everyone, our speakers, and we thank all the audience for the great participation this time. So we really appreciate. Any feedback is always welcome, and stay tuned. Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Yep.
Get the latest updates there in our LinkedIn and Facebook, and stay connected. Let's stay connected.